Okay, we heard, hello everybody. We heard in our last presentation that the dangerous part in the process of converting R&D into economic value or getting to the market is the valley of death. And we have on each side of the valley of death, on one side there is the resources available for research, and on the other side you have the resources available for commercialization from the private sector. And in the middle, there is usually a gap. It's very difficult to find the resources and the means for development, and indeed, it's a risky phase. And we have someone here today who has worked for the last decade at an institution that bridges the so-called valley of death, and he knows how to convert R&D into economic value. After all, Stanford Research Institute has come up with prototypes for products that we have all been using, such as the computer mouse, the high-definition television, or the Siri in our iPhones. Please, Dennis, too.
Thank you, Anna. Good morning, and thank you for your time and attention today. As Anna said, my name is Dennis Tsu. I just recently retired 2 weeks ago from SRI, the Stanford Research Institute, but I hope to still provide you some of that perspective, as well as my own personal perspective based on 35 years in Silicon Valley, trying to turn R&D into economic value. And so what Anna asked me to do this morning was to spend about an hour giving you a presentation and providing both a Silicon Valley, but also a global perspective on how to take R&D from your universities, from your research institutions, and translate that into commercial value, into economic value. The thing I want to emphasize, and that I hope you take away from my presentation more than anything else, is that this is a manageable process. But if you don't manage it, you will not have success. So to the question earlier of setting expectations, I think it's critically important if Estonia is going to invest more in R&D and make an effort to commercialize that R&D, that you set expectations appropriately. You have to manage the process. It requires an ecosystem. Government cannot do it on its own. It has a role, as we heard this morning, in setting certain policies, but it requires an ecosystem. It requires government, it requires the universities, it requires companies, and it requires capital, all of which have to be involved in making this effort a success. And my honest opinion, and something we'll talk about several times in the next hour, is that the biggest challenge for Estonia, which I think you already know, is critical mass. Estonia is not a big country. It doesn't have unlimited resources, and how to focus your resources, to the point that was made earlier this morning. Where to choose to focus your investments, I think, is going to be a critical decision for Estonia. A little bit of personal background. I won't dwell on this. My undergraduate degrees from Princeton, worked for a couple of consulting companies, went to Stanford Business School. Then I worked for a bunch of big tech companies, then a bunch of startups, the most successful of which, InfoGear, we sold to Cisco for $360 million or so. That was a very happy day. Then I've done a bunch of other startups that have not done so well. And that's also a very important learning process. And as Anna said, I've spent the last 5 years or so at SRI trying to share my perspective and knowledge on how to manage the process of innovation. And in doing that, I personally have actually done workshops for governments, universities, and enterprises from every single one of these countries. I've spent a lot of time in Helsinki and Turku and Tampere and Pori and lots of other cities in Finland, spent a lot of time in Sweden, spent time in Norway, as well as all around the world. And I'll try and share some of that perspective with you. Now, as we're talking about this, I want to clarify, since we're trying to talk about turning R&D into economic value, that there's two kinds of R&D. There's academic R&D, and then there's corporate R&D. Both are really important, and as you heard from the IMF this morning, and from Babu, corporate R&D in the United States is twice as big as the academic R&D. But in a lot of developing economies, this is not very robust yet, and I think that's true here in Estonia. So what I want to focus on this morning is the process of turning academic R&D into economic value. And my premise is that if you want to turn R&D into economic value, there are three ways you can do this. One is by licensing. In the United States, at SRI, probably 60–65% of our IP, of our R&D, gets translated to the market through a license, typically to a larger company, and that's a valid, a recognized, well-managed part of the transfer process. The one everybody likes to focus on is the new startup, okay? And to give you a metric here that I'll come back and talk about in a little bit, every year at SRI, we earn, we do about $400 to $500 million of research and development. Most of that for the US government, but also for a variety of other governments and corporations. From that $400 million, $500 million of research, our scientists every year submit to our patent office about 500 patent disclosure forms every year, okay? So roughly for every $1 million of research, there's a patent disclosure. Our lawyers read those. They don't always agree that that research is worth patenting. About 200 times a year, our patent office actually submits a patent application to the US Patent Office. 18 months, 24 months later, we typically get about 100 patents a year granted to us, okay? Our goal as a business is to take those 100 patents, sign 50 to 75 commercial licenses, and start up 5 to 10 new companies every single year, okay? To manage that process takes a team, takes a discipline, takes a process, and that's what I've been managing at SRI for the last 5 years, okay? And so I want to share some of that process with you. But then I don't want to neglect this last opportunity, because here in Estonia, with e-Estonia, you have already demonstrated that you can take a lot of invention and turn it into commercial value through the e-government initiatives. That's also a valid way of commercializing of IP and R&D, okay? So I want to talk about these processes this morning. Now, the problem, though, is despite the numbers you heard this morning about the importance of doing patents, the importance of creating IP, worldwide, if you look at the statistics, over 97% of patents that get approved by a government agency end up sitting in a file cabinet gathering dust. No commercial value, okay? Why? Why go through the effort? Why invent all this stuff if you're not going to be able to use it? And what I'll try and talk about this morning is that this process of taking IP and translating it to value requires a process if you're going to do it on a repeatable basis. And my premise, based on years of experience, is that this is a different set of skills. This is not something, as you just heard from Babu, this is not something that the typical professor or researcher or graduate student understands. It's not something they've been trained in. Is this process of commercialization, this process of tech transfer is foreign. It's strange. It's mercenary. It's commercial. And the academics are not really comfortable with that. And so many institutions across the world don't have the required skills, the required experience, the required mindset, or the critical mass to develop those skills and make this process work. And the other really important point is, again, as you heard from the IMF team, you're in a global competition, and I'll come back and talk about that some more. If Estonia is going to take its economy and move from the mid-tier to the upper tier, you have to be really good at this process. This is not an option. This is not a nice to have. It's an absolute requirement if you're going to drive your economy forward. Now, I like to use pictures and simple diagrams, and really the fundamentals of innovation to me, of turning IP into economic value, says you have to have ideas. That's the research, that's the technology generated at the universities. You have to have people. You have to have people who are willing to take risk, maybe fail. You have to have resources, money in particular, but legal structures and other support. And as Babu said, you need to have a market, okay? With these simple elements, if you understand them, you can take your ideas and get them to market, but it takes the other elements as well. And there are many players in an overall ecosystem, and I'll come back and talk about this some more. Government plays a role, the universities play a really important role, existing large companies, risk capital, and entrepreneurs are all required. You cannot skip one of these and be successful. You need all of these elements. Now, if you choose to do research in this area, choose to look at a bunch of the literature, there are two common ways that people describe the process of taking research and turning it into startups or new value. And one is a funnel, where you pour lots of ideas on the top and a little bit comes out the bottom. The other is a leaky pipeline, where you feed a bunch of ideas into one end and a much smaller number come out the other. They're both valid concepts, they both have pros and cons, but there are three key ideas, three key concepts that I think are important to understand about this process of turning IP into economic value. The first is that it is leaky. It is not guaranteed. There will be failure, okay? And it's critical to set the expectation at the beginning that not everything is going to succeed. And so understanding that and setting your own mindset and communicating that is really important. The second is that it does take a series of steps. It does take a progression of elements, as Babu said, with the lean startup process, with other processes. There are a series of steps, some of which have to be repeated multiple times. And the third element is time. And I want to spend just a second talking about time, because in many political environments where politicians, governments get elected every 4 years, and often they change, and priorities change, and programs change. That's really hard to run an effective innovation ecosystem if for the first 4 years you've got a right-wing government that's trying to encourage this, the next 4 years you've got a left-wing government that's trying to encourage that. Starting a company is a 5 to 10 year process. And trying to deal with flip-flops and going back and forth is a real challenge. And that's one of the other things I'll come back and talk about a little bit later. Now, you all know through Startup Estonia and other programs that there are steps, that there are processes. You've already described this, you've made great efforts. But you're not having the success you want. And this is hard work. And so some people might sit there and say, well, if it's so hard, why should I bother? And there's a very simple answer to that from my perspective. The simple answer is if you look at the US economy over the last 35 years, and you look at where the jobs came from. Over the last 35 years, the big companies, IBM, General Motors, Ford, other big companies, they have laid off 30 million people. They have gotten rid of 30 million jobs. Okay? All the growth in the US economy has come from startups. Some of those startups are now big companies. Google, Apple, didn't exist at the beginning of this, okay? But this is the engine that drives the US economy. And I believe in my gut, in my heart, that it's the engine that will drive every economy moving forward over time. If you want to make your country successful, if you want to make your economy grow, you have to learn how to innovate and create new jobs. And a key to that, in my opinion, is that it starts at the university. It starts with the professor. And you look at these two gentlemen, they look like professors. Old, white hair, right? The one on the top is John Hennessy. He used to be the president of Stanford. He just retired. The one on the bottom is Mark Tessier-Levine. He's the new president of Stanford. He just started last year. The interesting thing about these two gentlemen, for the purposes of this talk, is John left Stanford twice, took a leave of absence, and went and started a company, founded a company. He's made over $100 million through investing in 2 different startups and being part of that. Mark started a biotech company, also very successful. As a professor at Stanford, if you know that your president left the company, did a startup, was really successful, then came back to Stanford and is teaching again, that's a really powerful role model, okay? And so it's part of the, and Stanford, I would argue, is one of the top 5 universities, perhaps in the world, definitely in the US, that is leading the effort to commercialize and turn R&D into economic value. And it has, to the point that Babu was making, it has any number of implications for the professor. It has financial implications because at Stanford, if you commercialize a technology, the professor, the inventing team, gets 1/3 of the income that Stanford receives. Goes to the inventing team, the professor and his or her graduate students. It has a reputation effect because these professors, the students know who they are. The students want to study with them because the students want to go and start the next startup and get rich. So the students are attracted to these professors. To the point we were talking to Talent Tech yesterday, it also has an impact on your tenure score. Are you ready for tenure? Commercializing technology is a valid way of earning points towards tenure. And as I mentioned, it helps attract students. And so getting professors, getting the university involved in thinking about this is a critical part of the effort. And the other part that, again, the IMF team talked about earlier is R&D. And you know, these are statistics from Statistics Estonia, that Estonia doesn't spend as much as it could, perhaps, on R&D. Okay, your spending is roughly $500 million a year, at least a couple of years ago. The thing that worries me is that if you look at this over time, it's been going down, not going up. And to the point that was made by our first speakers this morning, if Estonia really wants to drive its economy forward, that trend has to be reversed. And what puzzles me is your prime minister is telling the EU, we have to do this. But the statistics don't back him up, okay? I don't know how to solve that problem. You all are much more expert on it. I can just observe this from afar, okay? And Babu made the point earlier that I just want to echo. At least in the United States, it's not all driven by the government, but in many developing countries, the government is still the major funder of R&D. But to the point from the IMF team this morning, the thing that's really hard, really difficult from a political perspective is if you've got a certain bucket of R&D funding, the easy answer from a votes perspective, from a popularity perspective, is to share the wealth. It's to share the R&D and spread it out among anybody who asks for it. The effective answer is to focus it like a laser on one or two areas, as you heard this morning. Choose those areas carefully and figure out where you're going to focus your R&D efforts. Really hard to do. But I would also argue really important. And that's one of the challenges, I would say, that Estonia faces. Not just Estonia, that every developing country faces, is where do you choose to focus, okay? And the other challenge you have is you're part of the EU, which is a wonderful thing, and it also presents some challenges, because now you've got your open European research area, and that is both a positive and a negative, because the concern I have, as again, an outside observer, is your best researchers will get sucked away to universities in other countries in the EU, and you'll have your brain drain kind of challenges. And so trying to figure out how to balance the focus and figuring out where you want to maintain a specialty is a big challenge, okay? Now, going back to these models of filtering and so forth, there's a number of steps, and I want to try here to sort of build on what Babu was talking about with the lean startup and so forth, and give you some perhaps practical tips on things to think about. And the first of those is something that I heard from several of your colleagues yesterday, which is that there's not enough capital, not enough risk capital in Estonia to really fund big startups. And so you can get them started, but then at some point you're going to need to go outside of Estonia to bring in more money to help these companies grow. And obviously, the US is one place to go look for that money. Russ Siegelman used to be a partner at Kleiner Perkins, one of the top 4 venture firms in the US. He's now a lecturer at Stanford Business School. I also lecture there from time to time. And he was quoted in Harvard Business Review last year as saying that the most important requirement from a funding perspective is size, market opportunity. And the general rule of thumb in the United States is that there has to be at least a $500 million market opportunity to make it worthwhile for a venture capitalist to pay attention, okay? Doesn't mean you're gonna earn $500 million in the first 5 years, but the market has to be that big, because if you're a leader and you get 20% market share, that means you can have $100 million in revenue, and that means that the investors can earn a return on their investment, okay? So I want to ask you, okay, well, if the requirement for an innovative idea from Estonia is $500 million in revenue, how do you get there? Okay? And this is a chart I've used in Mexico, in Brazil, in Singapore, in many different countries, and it ties to the point that was made earlier this morning about export focus. If you're trying to bring a foreign invention into Estonia, adapt it, put an Estonian user interface on it, I think it's pretty unlikely you're going to generate $500 million in revenue. If you invent something here in Estonia for the Estonian market, I think it's going to be really hard to generate $500 million in market opportunity, right? The only way I believe that you all in Estonia can create opportunities is focusing on taking Estonian innovations to the world. It's on exports, okay? And that's a critical element. And to do that, again, to Babu's point, that means you have to understand the customer outside of Estonia. You have to understand that customer in Poland, in Paris, in London, in New York, in San Francisco. How do you do that? How do you understand how are they going to buy? What are their decision criteria? And I would argue, based on, again, experience, that there are programs the government can institute, the universities can implement to encourage your students, your professors, to gather that knowledge, okay? You can do more partnerships with industry. You can do university enterprise partnerships. You can send students overseas. One of the most effective programs that I've seen implemented in several countries is that students get sponsored by the government to go overseas to study for 1, 2, 3 years with the commitment that once they graduate, they have to come back to the home country and work there for an equivalent period of time to pay back the government for that investment. You're encouraging your students to learn the market, to see the opportunities, and then you're bringing them back and keeping them here, okay? I would encourage you to think about things like that. I'd also say that another whole day's worth of workshop that we could talk about is one of the elements in the business model canvas that Babu talked about. Actually, the central element is the value proposition. And unfortunately, I have seen many professors who, if asked to describe their research project, pull out a PowerPoint deck that's about 50 slides long, and they start at slide 1 and they go to slide 50, and it doesn't change no matter who the audience is. And unfortunately, that doesn't work very well. In today's modern world, our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter, and you need to find a way, you need to teach yourselves and your students how to communicate their value proposition in under a minute. And there's many different ways this happens. The NABC happens to be something that SRI teaches, but there are many different ways to construct a value proposition. It's important, though, to be able to communicate that and do it effectively. And in doing that, one of the other really important points is that competition is not something to be scared of. Competition is actually good. It proves that a market exists. Everybody has competition, whether or not you like it. And the real question that people are sometimes scared of answering is, why am I better? Why should you, as a customer, change from whatever it is you're doing now to use my solution? And that's a hard thing to answer. And so whether you're Coke or Pepsi, a hotel or Airbnb, or Estonia and Lithuania, you have competition, okay? And understanding who your competition is and why you're better and being able to articulate that is a critical part of being able to commercialize your IP. Another element in all of this is that universities tend to be full of people with ideas, with inventors. My experience as an entrepreneur is I'm really bad at this, really, really bad. I'm pretty good at this. And most successful startups, you need both. And so the question is, how do you teach? How do you find these people? How do you match them up with the inventors? What in your ecosystem, whether it's Mectory or other things, other programs that you implement here in Estonia, how do you create that marriage? And then over time, how do you grow it into a real organization? Okay? This takes skill, this takes practice, this takes knowledge, and it's part of the process. And again, my version of the business model canvas, you can go online and search a lot of different venture capital websites, and they'll all give you slightly different variations of this. You need to be able to put together a 10-slide pitch that you can present in 20 minutes that explains your business. And it's really hard to do. To do this well, to do this effectively, takes coaches and mentors who have done this, who can help people learn how to make those pitches. You can find these people here in Estonia, you can find them in the Nordics or the other Baltics, but finding those coaches and helping your teams put together this business plan is a really critical element. SRI has run business plan competitions for the governments of Chile, Japan, China, Korea, Turkey, and elsewhere that help teams figure out how to do this. And then, again, to build on Babu's point, starting a company requires money. There's just no way around it if you're going to grow something of any reasonable size. By definition, it's risky. It will not always succeed. And so there's a question of who's going to provide that funding. Who's willing to roll the dice and make a bet and potentially lose their investment. And so there are many different forms of risk capital. Babu mentioned many of these already. And the question I would ask in here, I think that you all are debating, is what should be the role of the Estonian government in perhaps encouraging or supplementing this kind of capital? As you're thinking about that, I will suggest that there's a process that we think companies go through as they mature, as they go through some of those cycles that Babu was talking about. At the very beginning, you've got an idea. Somebody invented something, they've got a disclosure. Somebody then takes a little bit of effort, says, you know, that actually is unique. We'll go ahead and patent it. We'll put together a value proposition and take it forward. Then you do customer validation, as Babu said. You do more business planning. You go out and raise funding. Don't focus on the specifics, but there's a progression that you go through with any startup. The challenge for Estonia, and for many developing countries, is that in the US, in well-developed ecosystems, like the San Francisco Bay Area or Boston, Stanford, MIT, their tech transfer offices can focus on the first couple of steps because there's a big innovation ecosystem that covers the latter half of this equation. I will argue that in Estonia, that's not true. In Estonia, the local innovation ecosystem may start here. And so the university or somebody is going to have to fill that gap in the middle. And the question is who? There are multiple different answers. It can be the government. It could be an organization like Mectory. It could be an organization like Startup Estonia. But somebody needs to think about who's filling the gaps and be able to explain this to an entrepreneur so that they're not sitting there scratching their head saying, where do I go for help? Make it easy. Make it simple. And as I said earlier, I believe critical mass is really important. In Silicon Valley, a typical VC receives over 300 business plans every year. Out of those 300, they'll fund 5, if they're lucky, okay? Think about those success rates. Think about the failures. This takes practice. And so where do you find the critical mass? How do you aggregate this to develop the skills, to know how to filter? This is a challenge, not just for Estonia, but it's the same challenge in Lithuania, in Latvia, in Finland, in Sweden. It's the exact same challenge. We did, I'm going to shift gears on you here for a minute. We did, SRI and Stanford Business School did a study for the World Economic Forum about 4 years ago now. And we surveyed 1,400 entrepreneurs around the globe and asked them, what do you need to build, to have a successful innovation ecosystem? And there were some pretty simple things that all make common sense. You need a market. Estonia is not a very big market, as we've talked about already. So you need to have the European community as a minimum, perhaps a bigger market to be thinking about. You need people. I think there are lots of really talented, I've met several here in Estonia. You need people. You need funding. The risk capital infrastructure in Estonia needs some work, but you need funding. You need coaches, you need mentors, advisors, support systems. I think you're doing a very good job of building that, but it could still be improved. You need a regulatory environment. I think Estonia wins in that competition on a global basis. It's really easy to set up a company. You've done all that. I think that's wonderful. You need education and training. You need to teach your young people how to be entrepreneurs. And that's different from being a manager in a big company. And so you need that training at the university. And I think Talent Tech is on top of that. You need the universities to be catalysts. And I think right now that's a challenge, and I'll come back and talk about that. And then lastly, you need cultural support. And the simplest way I find to think about this is when your son or daughter graduates from college and tells you, Mom, Dad, I'm going to go work for a startup instead of taking that job with the government that's nice and secure, Mom and Dad have to say, yay, that's the right answer. And that's hard, okay? We surveyed 1,400 entrepreneurs around the globe, and what you see is in Silicon Valley, we do pretty well on most of these metrics. There's still a little bit too much red tape to set up a company, but we're better than the rest of the United States. You compare that to Europe, you got lots of great people, but there's some challenges. I don't know how many of these folks were from Estonia, but this is all public data. I would encourage you to think about it. Think about your ecosystem, think about the infrastructure here, and how do you move this forward? Now, I know there are many people from the academic community here. You've got some wonderful universities in the country, and there are really three products that I think the universities are responsible for producing, for developing as part of their role. The first, of course, is the idea, the technology. That's pretty straightforward. The second is entrepreneurial students. That's harder. And the third is culture, that was talked about by Babu and others this morning. You know all these companies. And apart from the fact that they're all in the IT industry and they're all big, do you know what they all have in common? All of them were founded by students. Not professors, not alumni. Actually, every single one of these companies, the founders dropped out of college or university to start these companies. Now, I don't want to encourage all your students to drop out of university here in Estonia, but I want you to think about that. Why can this happen? To put this another way, my son graduated from Stanford 5-6 years ago now. When he was graduating, they did a survey of his graduating class. And they asked his graduating class, where do you expect to be 5 years after you graduate? Normal sort of question. About 9% of his classmates were going to medical school. They said, we'll be doctors. Yay, good. About 7 to 8% of his classmates were going to law school. They said, we'll be lawyers. I'm not the biggest fan of lawyers, but okay, I respect that. Over half, greater than 50% of his class said that 5 years after leaving Stanford, they expected to be working for a startup. Maybe not as a founder, but they expected to be working for a startup. Okay? How do you... And I have not found another university anywhere in the world that has similar expectations, okay? How do you build this kind of culture, this kind of expectation into Estonia is a question, because I think if you want, again, to go back to Anna's point, if you want the country to grow and be successful, this is part of it. Okay? Now, I know, again, talking about the university, that the role of the university, and this is not unique to Estonia, this is an issue in universities around the world. I have had this discussion with the rectors of Católica University in Chile, with the rector of National University in Singapore, with lots of other senior university officials. 500 years ago, back when Old Town here was still the center of everything, the university was really the monastery. It was a monk copying the Bible on parchment, preserving knowledge. That was the role 500, 600 years ago. About 350 years ago, the printing press was invented. All of a sudden, there were books. And the role of the university became that of sharing knowledge, spreading the knowledge. About 150 years ago, the steam engine was invented. Science all of a sudden started playing a primary role. And the role of the university became driving research. Today, the debate at Harvard, at Stanford, is about what's the university's role in driving economic growth, okay? As I said, I went to Princeton earlier. The president of Princeton has said, no, I don't want to do this. I think that's a mistake. I think that the role of the university has got to change as economies move forward and as the world moves forward. And I think that you here in Estonia have already started to acknowledge that. But this needs to continue. This needs to gain support and move forward. Now, the other aspect is culture, okay? There's a lot of people still who hear the word innovation and they say, people are going to lose jobs, it's going to change the world, I don't like it. What I believe needs to happen to help innovation become an integral part of your economy is people have to be excited and looking forward to the opportunity to innovate. A couple of other thoughts here and then I'll wrap up. There have been a number of studies over the last decade about where does talent come from? Where do ideas and innovations come from? And in 2007, there was a study done of every single startup in Silicon Valley that received funding. And in over half of those startups, one or more of the founders were not born in the United States. They were born in India, Japan, China, all over the world. 9 years later, another study that was done said that over 50% of the billion-dollar startups in the US, one or more of the founders were immigrants. Again, lots of different countries. And if you look at a third study, over 70% of the key management positions in our startup companies are held by immigrants, okay? Immigration, despite our president, and I won't get into politics too much, immigration drives economic growth, my belief, okay? And we showed a lot of this research in a course that again, I sometimes teach at Stanford Business School. In one of those courses, there was a student who happened to be the son of the president of Chile. He went home at Christmas, he talked to his father about this, and Chile started a program called Startup Chile. And an entrepreneur anywhere in the world, Estonia, Ukraine, can send a business plan to the Chilean government. If they like it, they will send you 2 visas, say, please, come to Chile. When you get off the airplane, they will hand you a check for $40,000. No equity, here's money, go. You have to do a few reports to the government to just show what you're doing. They fully expect that 75% of those ideas will fail. They are okay with that expectation. They've set that at the beginning. But what they're doing is they're building the talent base of entrepreneurs in Chile. And over the last 6 years, over 2,500 entrepreneurs from all around the world have moved to Chile to start companies. Okay? I don't know if that's the right answer, but what I can tell you is that if you're a smart entrepreneur in Ukraine or Belarus or Russia, I sure wouldn't want to stay in my home country if I've got a really good idea. And they're going to move someplace. The question is where? Do they move to Helsinki? Do they move to Stockholm? Do they move to Tallinn? Okay? You are in a competition. You are in a global competition for talent, for entrepreneurs. And you can choose to try and attract them into your country, or you can say no. That's a choice you have to make, okay? And I would argue that opening the doors, inviting and encouraging people to come here is a more positive way to approach the problem. Because this is a challenge. You know how the population of Estonia has been shrinking over the last decade or two. And I will argue, as you heard this morning, that there are alternative models. There are models that say, with a similar starting point, maybe a little bit bigger, in the same time frame, you can grow a population, an economy, and opportunity. And this is a big fundamental question that, again, is not unique to Estonia. This is an issue that faces many European community members of how open do you want to be to immigration and attracting people. The other difficult point that I want to acknowledge, and it goes to a question earlier, is I have done 7 startups, okay? As a founder, as an executive officer. One of them was a big success. 4 are still alive, but we sold the companies to another company sort of just to get a little bit of cash back. 2, dead, okay? I'm doing better than the average venture capitalist, than the average investor in Silicon Valley. With 1 in 7 success, I'm doing pretty well. In Silicon Valley, that's okay. It's normal. It's part of what we expect. But what I've heard is that here in Estonia, failure, not so easy to accept and embrace, okay? It is part of the equation, and that's something that you need to think about. I will give you kudos for the fact that you have a very high social trust index. I think this is awesome. It's a critical element in making an innovation ecosystem work, is people trusting each other and helping each other out and cooperating. That's great. But a challenge is capital, okay? And for a venture capital investor, for a risk capital investor, there are really 3 things that they're going to want to be, that they'll want to have available to make a big investment in a country. One is deal flow, just opportunities to look at new ideas and evaluate them. Second is a constructive regulatory environment. And third is an opportunity to exit, okay? I think Estonia does really well on the middle one. I think deal flow, I don't know what the opportunity flow is like here in the country. And I know your stock market is small. And so I would encourage, again, you all as leaders in the economy to think about how do you respond to that? How do you perhaps look at other options to encourage venture capital activity? And it's also really important, I tell entrepreneurs all the time, you can't grow a company without cash. And you have to understand what your investors are willing to invest in. And this happens to be the 2015, the 16 study is coming out soon, a study of where did venture capitalists in the US invest their money by sector, okay? This varies by country. This varies by city. If you look at venture capital confidence in the biopharma sector, specifically biopharma, by geography in the same year, 2015, if I were starting a biopharma company back then, I would look at Brazil, I would look at China, I would look at Taiwan, and I would stay the hell away from Germany. Why? I don't honestly know. But it's important to understand this. It's important to be working together with your financial community if you want to build an innovation ecosystem that works. And please, if you're going down this path, be aware that the typical life of a venture fund is 7 to 10 years. Again, to the point about political cycles, if you're changing governments every 4 years, but an investor is investing with a 7 to 10 year time horizon, investors do not like uncertainty. They like stability, they like predictability. And so understanding how to put programs in place that will run 5, 10, 15, 20 years to provide that stability to your investment community is really, really, really important. Last couple of charts. From a government perspective, I think your government is awesome. With all credit to Anna and the others that I've met, I think you're thinking about this, and I want to give you applause for consciously thinking about innovation as part of your economy. It has to be easy to set up and shut down a company. You've got that nailed. It's 4 days, or maybe now it's down to 1 day to set up a company here in Estonia. You've got the e-residency opportunities. You've got that nailed. That's awesome. As was mentioned earlier, you need to invest in education. And not any kind of education, but education that encourages entrepreneurship and risk-taking. That's important. Would encourage you to continue to do that. I'll honestly say you need to double the amount of money you invest in R&D. I know that's hard because it's got to come away from someplace else, but I think that's part of the equation. You need to support entrepreneurship and risk-taking. I think you're trying to do that already. Continue to do that. And you need to figure out a way to get more risk capital into the country. I think these are all critical elements for the government and a policy role that you can play. Couple of closing thoughts here. This is hard work. This is not easy. This is not guaranteed success. But it can and should be managed. There are processes for thinking about this. This is not a total roll of the dice. It's not playing craps. And it requires a certain critical mass, and would really encourage you to think about how to build that. I will say that as I went on the internet and I looked at some of the research you have done, you know these challenges. The country already understands the challenges. I want to give you a couple of examples from some neighbors, though, to think about. I was invited by Vinnova and Almi, the government agencies in Sweden, about 3 years ago, to be on an international advisory board that examined their national incubator system. They had been running it for 7 years. They had to do a report to the government. And so we gathered lots of data, or they gathered lots of data, and I looked at it. They had run, in Sweden, 42 incubators, okay? And I want you to think about that. Sweden's a little bit bigger than Estonia, but 42 incubators up and down Sweden is an awful lot of incubators. Pretty much any town over about 50,000 people had an incubator in it. The good news is those incubators had looked at about 25,000 business ideas over 7 to 10 years. They'd only accepted about 10%, so they were reasonably picky. They were reasonably selective. Those companies stayed in the incubator for a little over 2 years, and then they launched. 95% of them launched. And after several years, 43% were still in business. Great. But the average number of employees, 3, average turnover, less than $300,000 a year. Okay? Is that what you want? That was the question to the Swedish government. What were you trying to do when you set up this program? Are you trying to start lots of little, small, 3-person companies, or are you trying to start the next Skype or Facebook? Okay? They didn't even gather the data on mergers and acquisitions and IPOs and other results. Okay? So my perspective, my argument to them is the program was designed wrong. This is not what you were wanting to do. And so I would encourage you to think about that as Estonia looks at implementing programs. And I can give you lots of other examples of both well-designed programs and not so well-designed programs. But you need to think about what are you trying to do and design your systems appropriately. And then the last thought that I'll give you is from another one of your neighbors a little further away, in Norway. As was mentioned earlier, Norway has had the benefit of North Sea oil and had a lot of resources as a result of that. And they've set up a number of Norwegian centers of excellence, some of them in the oil industry, for instance. But Raufoss is a little town in the middle of no place in Norway that was originally 100 years ago, or 150 years ago, the center for making ammunition, bullets and cannon shells for the Norwegian army when they were battling the Swedes. Over time, they've evolved. They're now a center of excellence focused on automotive manufacturing, metal bending, making parts for the auto industry. I was there with the government, and I met the president, Sverre Narvesen, of this center of excellence. And he said, Dennis, this part of Norway has no raw materials. It's got forest, it's got lakes, but no real raw materials. Our cost of people is 67% higher than the world average, based on IMF World Economic Forum data. And he said, but our standard of living today is 75% above average. So we're living at a pretty high economic status. His worry, Sverre's worry, is he was worried about his grandkids. He was saying, how do I guarantee that my grandchildren will live just as well as I am living 50 years from now? Okay? And he said, for us to do that without raw materials, it's all about people. It's all about innovation. It's about thinking about how do we create new ideas, how do we do better in the new economy than the rest of the world. Because if we don't, the innovators in India, in China, in Brazil, in the US will move forward and we will stay flat. And that means our relative standard of living will fall. Okay? That, I think, is a fundamental challenge, not just for Norway, not just for Estonia, but as I think our economists would agree, it's a fundamental challenge for every country in the world. It's what do you want to do about innovation? Do you want to be a leader in innovation? Do you want to be better at the process of managing innovation than your peers? Do you want to be just as good and stay flat? Do you want to be worse at the process and fall behind? That's a conscious choice I would encourage you to think about. Because knowledge, you know the problems. Knowledge does not equal action. And the question that I always like to ask people is, what are you going to do differently tomorrow? What will you do when you think about this? How will you change the way you behave? Okay? So with that, let me say thank you. I appreciate your time. I hope this was educational, and I would love to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Dennis, for your very enlightening presentations. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. I will start again, since I have the microphone in my hand. Well, they say that it takes a lot of money to move the needle, especially in R&D. And Estonia doesn't have an applied research institute like SRI or VTT in Finland. And we have these technology development centers set up with EU funds. Most likely some of them will be temporary. And they are scattered over different fields and places across Estonia. So my question to you would be, in a small country setting like Estonia is, would it make sense to create an applied research institute?
I will speak from a slightly biased perspective, having worked for an applied research institute for the last 5 years. But I think the answer is yes. I think that there are benefits to centralizing the management and commercialization focus of an applied research center in a common area and developing critical mass. So I would argue yes, and because I do think you were competing with VTT in Finland, Fraunhofer in Germany, and elsewhere, that developing those skills and developing the infrastructure for that in Estonia is from my perspective, a good investment.
Thank you. Thea, please.
Thank you, Dennis, for this absolutely fantastic presentation. You very rightly pointed out that startups are the employment of the future. But still, what about the existing companies? I mean, the companies where the bulk of the export is coming at the moment, for example, and some of them are eagerly searching for how to reshape their business models and how to put the company development on the new tracks. And as it was mentioned in the first presentation, that Nokia started off as a rubber company, so it should serve as an example to the point. So what are the recommendations to deal with this kind of reshaping of the existing businesses from the point of view of state support?
It's a great question, and there's several different perspectives that I'll share with you there. The first is that many large companies in the US and around the world have consciously, very deliberately adopted a strategy of acquiring companies. So a Cisco, a General Electric, a Facebook, and so forth, they are all now actively managing technology scout teams that are always around the world looking for new startups that they can acquire to help them grow. And so one option is to adopt that as a conscious strategy. I'll give you a different perspective. I was talking with Banco Santander, a large Spanish bank, about their strategy for innovation. And they said, Dennis, we don't think we know how to manage innovation. We're not trying to be leaders in innovation. But what we have determined is that at the same time, while we can't lead innovation, we can't ignore it. And so their conscious strategy is to be what they call a fast follower. So they will track what other banks do in innovation and then very quickly they've changed their infrastructure, they have made certain investments so that when they see change happening elsewhere in the financial industry, they can react very quickly and follow. That's a different kind of strategy. A third strategy is to adopt, as I think Babu was mentioning earlier, more open innovation policies and look outside of the enterprise for more innovative ideas and how to incorporate those into the pull them into the enterprise product pipeline over time. Any one of those is a whole nother hour-long presentation about how those different topics work. What I will say is that I'm actually, on Friday morning, I'm back in California. I'm making a presentation to about 100 people who are board members of large Fortune 200 kinds of companies in the United States. And the question the board members are all asking is, they've all seen how Amazon has changed a lot of industries already. They've seen what Apple and Facebook and Google are doing. And boards now, all across the United States and indeed around the world, I think if they're doing their job right, are asking, who's going to be disrupting my industry? Who's going to be changing the way this works? And what's our responsibility as a board for helping the management think about that? And what do we recommend that they do? I think, again, in a country like Estonia, the government has an opportunity perhaps to do conferences like this focused on the larger enterprises in Estonia and asking them, how do you anticipate change? What should you be doing? And the last thought I'll give you just on that point is a metric that many companies in Silicon Valley use to try and measure their success in anticipating change, is they look at the percentage of their revenue that comes from products or services that have been introduced in the last 5 years. Okay? So you introduced a product 20 years ago, it's still really successful, that's great. But what percentage of your revenue is coming from new products, new services that you've introduced in the last 5 years? And I would argue if that isn't at least 10 to 15%, you're in danger. The best companies, it's closer to 25, 30% of their revenue is coming from products that have been introduced in the last 5 years. And that'll help you grow. And so thinking about metrics like that, thinking about tools would be things that I would encourage.
Very good. One more question over there.
Thank you very much for sharing your ideas this morning with us. You mentioned that you do not subscribe to the point of view held in Princeton that universities should not primarily or to that great extent act as economic agents or agents of economic growth. Can you please elaborate, why do you believe differently? Or maybe in other words, what would be your 3 bullet point answer to those accusing modern universities of mercantilism?
Yes, fair. Entirely great question. And that is exactly the challenge, that the universities don't want to be seen as mercenary, as being too commercially motivated. And I think there is a difference between public universities and private universities on this spectrum. I was talking with some folks at Talent Tech yesterday and asked them, what's the culture here in Estonia about successful business people donating charitable funds back to universities, other institutions. In America, at Stanford, at MIT, at a number of universities, they've actually done the research that says it's better to license your technology quickly, easily, and for less money than you might otherwise get, because if that company that licensed your technology is successful 5 to 10 years from now, your development office can go back to them and ask that entrepreneur to donate funds to endow a professor's chair, to build a new building, to build a new laboratory, to build a new library. And it's a, unfortunately, whether or not we like it, the process of educating students is not cheap. And the amount of tuition we can charge students, at least in the US, only covers about half of the cost of educating that student. And so the endowment and the income from the endowment is actually critically important to private universities in the United States, like Stanford and Princeton and MIT. And so I will argue as an economist that it's in your economic preservation interests and your business model preservation interests to encourage activity that will grow your endowment, that will allow you to remain competitive with the other universities that are doing this. And since you have universities like Stanford and MIT, and now to some extent Harvard, that are actively pursuing commercialization strategies, I think those universities that do not will suffer in the long run. And that's more than a 3-bullet answer, but that's my perspective.
Any more questions? All right, so it seems that everybody is ready for lunch. But before that, Dennis, thank you again so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have a small presentation for you.
Thank you. Thank you.